flood is the most likely theory. About 200 years after the flood, there were probably a few thousand people in the world by then, and they were decided to build this tower, you know, and in spite of God's commands to get out and spread out and replenish the earth and all that stuff. And so they decided in rebellion to God to build this tower. God came down and confused their languages. The people had to go off then marrying somebody from their own family. Now, in the original creation, this would not be a problem with the pure genetic code. He married sisters with no problem. Adam married his rib with no problem. But after the flood, you would start to have problems, genetic problems, and today we have 3,500 defective genes, and it's just about genetic suicide to marry somebody closer than a first cousin. So probably after the flood, the Tower of Babel, they broke up, everybody speaking French went one way, everybody speaking Italian went someplace else, and the Germans, and et cetera, and they had to marry family. And under those conditions, like the Habsburg dynasty, you start to get some pretty weird-looking rednecks after a while. So I suspect that the races probably came as a result of the inbreeding a few hundred years after the flood, Tower of Babel. That's one of 4 possible explanations from Scripture. That beats believing all the races came from a rock by a long shot.
I wish you would stop saying that. No evolutionary biologist believes that we come from a rock. But anyway, the other thing to do is you realize that he's making it up as we go. I mean, what does it mean to have a pure genetic code? That's not a biological term. I don't know what a pure genetic code is. And in fact, one of the problems with the Adam and Eve story is exactly that marrying your rib is not really a good idea. Your children are not going to be in good shape. So I don't even know what the pure genetic code is. There's no such thing. Genetic code is genetic code. Genes are genes. There's no such a thing as a pure or an impure gene. Genes are different from each other because of mutations. Some of them work better than others, but they're not pure or impure. It's not a genetic term.
What mechanism would you propose to insert new information into the genetic code? Mutation seems unable to do this.
I'm so glad somebody asked that question. First of all, mutations do that, because mutation is, by definition, a change in information, therefore, encoded in the genetic code. Therefore, you do have new information, meaning that you have information that is different from what was there before. If by new information you mean additional information, additional quantity of information, there are several mechanisms that do that. They go under the names of gene duplication, chromosomal duplication, and polyploidy. These are observable under laboratory conditions. You can come to my lab and do it yourself. In a few days or a few weeks, you can actually multiply genes and multiply by natural occurrences, not by artificial means. You can observe genes duplicating themselves, and you can observe chromosomes multiplying into organisms in a way that then they become stable. They have added, essentially, genetic information. So adding genetic information is not the problem. The real question is, what do you do with that genetic information? That's where natural selection comes into play, and it screens out things that don't work very well and keeps things that work a little better. Incidentally, natural selection is not what's called an optimizing mechanism. That is, it doesn't produce perfect things. Sometimes evolution is called the survival of the fittest. A better metaphor is the survival of the barely tolerable. If you're good enough to survive, then you're in, and if you're not good enough to survive, then you're out.
Okay, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution, Pierre Gross says, who's a strong believer in evolution. Mutations are a re-scrambling of gene code. It doesn't give you any new information. Polyploidy, as you should know, if anybody, being a plant botanist, that just simply doubles existing information. It doesn't give you new information. It's a copy of the original code. This bull, for instance, has 5 legs. No new information has been added. He has a copy of a leg put in the wrong place. That's not new information. Here's a short-legged sheep. No new information added. This is a mutation. Two-headed turtle. There's no new information. It's a doubling of information. That is not evolution, and it's not ninja. It's just a mutant turtle. It's scrambling. This biology textbook shows the kids a mutant fly. It says normal flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4. This rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. Beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Well, excuse me, but why didn't they show us a beneficial mutation? Nobody's ever proven one. And if you did have a beneficial mutation, who would it marry? And who would the grandkids marry? And the great-grandkids? You got a real serious problem here. Nobody's ever proven a beneficial mutation. And scrambling information that already exists is not creating new information. And doubling the copying the code, I'm embarrassed that you would say polyploidal is an example of new information. You, of anybody, should know it is not new information.
Dr. Hovind. You acknowledge that variations exist in creationist view of the origin of life, i.e. zebras, horses. All life began 6,000 years ago. Where is the evidence of the birth of these variations? Surely someone would have witnessed the birth of a zebra from a horse or the Great Dane from a Chihuahua.
The question is a little convoluted and confusing. Start again.
Okay. You acknowledge that variations exist in creationist view of the origin of life, i.e. zebras and horses. All life began 6,000 years ago. Where is the evidence of the birth of those variations? Surely someone would have witnessed them.
I don't think there's any question that variations happen. The question is, how far can it go? As far as the horse and the zebra having a common ancestor, I don't know when it happened, or even if it happened. I suspect that it could have happened, and that would be a legitimate field of research for scientists. But then to conclude that horses and bananas are related is way beyond the observable evidence. And I showed you from the textbooks, they do teach the kids we all came from a rock. That's what it boils down to. I know you don't like me saying that. Well, you ought to get rid of that dumb theory, and I wouldn't have to say it. Variations happen, but they have limits, okay? Farmers breed for bigger pigs, but they're never going to get a pig as big as Texas. Roaches become resistant to pesticides, but they will never become resistant to a sledgehammer, okay? Yes, variations happen, but they're limited, and they always produce the same kind of plant or animal. That's not evolution. And the information for the variation is already present in the gene code. Nothing new is ever added. The gene pool of the new variety is now more limited. Somebody spent years developing a Chihuahua. All that work to make a 100% useless dog. Genetic information is lost when you get a variant. Ask any farmer that raises anything. The further you get away from the norm with your hybrid, the more problems you start to have. Either disease resistance goes down, or like the Great Danes, or many dogs have hip dysplasia, you get problems. You might get one desirable trait, like a cow that gives more milk, but you always get some other problem someplace else. And if you turned all the dogs in the world loose back into the woods, 90% of the varieties we have today wouldn't survive. Up in Alaska, probably the long-haired ones would survive, and in the desert, the short-haired dingoes would survive. But you're always going to have a dog. That's not new information.
You did say that 10,000 species gave origin to millions of species in the last 4,000 years. So that question was right. Somebody must have observed that happening one of those times at least. It is also very interesting that you keep saying that nobody has ever observed the origin of a new species. That is absolutely not true. There are some examples in the biological literature of direct observations of the origin of new species, both in animals and in plants. Since you've cited your tapes and